Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie, and in this video I'm going to be looking at the weekend of October the 11th and 12th 2025, and over the weekend we have an opposition between Venus and Saturn, and this aspect has perhaps a rather unfortunate reputation. It's not considered to be a good aspect, and so I thought I would look at this opposition in some detail at the end of this video. But before I do that, I want to consider the astrology and the I Ching for the weekend. So here is the chart of the weekend set for midnight on Sunday the 12th. So at midnight, New York time, the moon is at 28 Gemini London time. No, sorry, New York time. So the weekend starts with the moon in Gemini and it ends with the moon in Cancer. So the moon, when it moves through late Gemini, is making square aspects to Venus and Saturn. So this means that, we have a T-square, moon opposition, moon square Venus, moon square Saturn. And so this means that we have to consider, what does the Venus-Saturn opposition actually mean? Well, I'll be going into this in much greater detail later in the video, but suffice it to say, Venus is a fortunate planet. It's regarded as being the lesser benefic, Jupiter being the greater benefic. But, at the moment, Venus, is in Virgo. That's not the best place for Venus to be in, the best sign for Venus to be in. It's fallen in Virgo. And then it's opposition Saturn. And so we get a kind of a double message here. It's potentially quite material, quite transactional, thinking about what needs to be done, and finding it quite difficult to sort of just go with the flow. That can be a problem with Venus and Virgo, and it can be a particular problem when Venus is opposition Saturn. And then the moon is on the T, and this T square, I think I'll be talking about it at the end of the video again in more detail, but I think it might be that the moon is somehow the key. The moon is in Gemini, and if you've got the moon in Gemini, how do you resolve that situation where things just don't work on an emotional level? Things might seem to be a bit frozen. Well, one way of resolving it would be, the moon in Gemini, is to talk about it. If emotions aren't flowing, then you can find other ways to communicate, and it would make sense to talk about things, to be quite logical about it. Now, the moon on Saturday, when it is moving through late Gemini, it makes a trine to the sun, and so possibly Saturday, early on Saturday, things aren't so bad. There's still a Venus-Saturn opposition, but I think that the Venus-Saturn opposition is going to be at its peak when the moon makes the square. Earlier on Saturday, when you do have supposedly the exact Venus-Saturn opposition, you also have a moon trine sun, and maybe that's just a similar message. Moon trine sun is about harmony, but how can you have harmony when Venus is opposition Saturn? Well, I think you have to remember that this trine between the moon and the sun is in air signs. Moon in Gemini, sun in Libra. So the air signs are about communication, what you are talking about, what you are thinking about. And so just because there's an emotional block doesn't mean that there needs to be a mental or an intellectual block. Now, as far as Sunday is concerned, the moon is moving into Cancer. And so, the moon moves into Cancer on Sunday at 7:37 a.m. London time. So that's going to be sort of in the middle of the night if you're in New York. So by the time the day gets going in the Americas and in Europe and Africa, the moon will be in Cancer. So there is a change there. So moon going into Cancer, it is making a square to Neptune. It's also making a trine to Mercury slowly. So I think that moon in Cancer probably going to be easier for moon in Gemini because of that Saturn influence. And so moon in Cancer, there may be a sort of greater emotional flow on Sunday compared to Saturday, though that does depend to an extent on your time zone. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, then that Venus opposition Saturn might linger for longer. And turning to the chart for Sydney, Australia, again as a representative of Australasia and East Asia at midnight, the moon is at 19 Gemini. So the moon is, if you're in Australasia, the moon's going to be in Gemini for the whole weekend, pretty much. Okay, it will move into Cancer, right at the end on Sunday evening, and so with moon in Gemini, to be optimistic about it, that moon trine the sun, that the harmony that moon trine that aspect brings may be quite clear in Australia, and so if you are in Australia or New Zealand, perhaps Saturday, won't be such a bad day, and then Sunday could potentially be more complicated, where it may be sort of more difficult to get things moving, especially on an emotional level. And then there is the heliocentric view, putting the sun at the center of the solar system, and there is a T-square. So Mars is still opposition Uranus. It's pretty close to the opposition of Uranus now, just 14 arc minutes. So we can say all we want about Mars opposition Uranus. It can be a difficult aspect, and then Venus is on the T. So how does one see Venus being on the T? Well, Venus square Uranus, Venus square Mars. You might say that Venus just intensifies it, just brings it into focus. So, Mars opposition Uranus is an aspect that can be about violence, can be about people being very willful. They want their way, and you're just not going to find compromise very easily. And it's not just people; it's organizations. It's people handling world affairs and diplomacy, coming to an agreement. It could be hard work. I mean, I know that there's been this ceasefire in Gaza. One does wonder how it's all going to proceed. Whether it's going to be as great as everyone says. I'm sure Donald's very disappointed about not getting the Nobel Peace Prize. They gave it to a Venezuelan woman instead. So that was a big blow to Donald not getting the Nobel Peace Prize. But should Donald Trump have been given a Nobel Peace Prize in Gaza? Well, it's probably still work in progress. Just because things are working out fine right now, it doesn't mean to say that the situation in Gaza, is going to stay fine. I think there's a good chance that it won't. So. Probably one shouldn't give him a Peace Prize too early. Let's see how it goes. But anyway, we've got Mars opposition Uranus, and that is an aspect that doesn't like to compromise. And then Venus comes along and makes the T to it. And you could say, oh, well, Venus is a pleasant influence. It perhaps creates a possibility of compromise, that people can somehow handle working together in spite of the great pressure. So that's certainly a way of looking at that T-square. But it may just be that Venus is a trigger. Venus just comes along, aspects Mars, aspects Uranus, and brings the whole thing into prominence, that Mars opposition Uranus. So this weekend Venus is doing stuff. We looked at the weekend geocentrically, Venus is opposition Saturn. Heliocentrically, Venus is square Uranus, Venus is square Mars. So whichever way you look at it, Venus, does matter. So I'm now going to turn to the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for the weekend of October the 11th and 12th, 2025. Aries. Things are in a state of change, I think. You're finding that it's just increasingly difficult to, really get your message across. On Saturday it's probably okay. I mean, you can say whatever needs to be said, but as the day progresses, it just might become harder, and there might be resistance. As an Aries, you like things to be straightforward. You don't like complications, and those complications could start to come in, sort of perhaps thick and fast, and so you might be disappointed, for example, by other people's being not really very responsive, and perhaps also not being particularly sensitive. They don't really understand what you're saying, what you're trying to say, and they perhaps find it difficult to read between the lines. And so if you have got anything to say, then probably you should try to say it on Saturday as early in the day as possible, and then as you move into Sunday, I do think that things will start to slow down, and perhaps that's the way they should be. That's the way things should be. You need to think about what is important to you, and not feel that you have to be pressurized. I don't think anyone is really going to be pressurizing you. I think that to an extent people are going to want to be left to their own devices, and you want to be left to your own devices, and that should be the way it all works. However, we shouldn't forget that Mars is making a heliocentric opposition to Uranus. So this Mars opposition Uranus heliocentrically has been brewing for some time. I'm not saying that it's necessarily going to affect you. It is a heliocentric opposition. But Mars opposition Uranus could stir you up. Particularly as Venus is making a square to Mars, Venus is making a square to Uranus. Again, heliocentrically. Just remind you of the heliocentric chart. There's Mars, your ruler, opposition Uranus, and you've got Venus square Uranus, Venus square Mars. So because of this heliocentric opposition, this does stir you up at quite a deep level. You want to do something. You're just not satisfied with the way things are, and you want to do something. And so what do? I think that you perhaps have to be careful. You don't want to just follow your instincts, your Aries instincts, and do something. Just do something dramatic, whatever, it doesn't matter, provided you get a response. That could be how it works. And if you were to do that, I think the results would quite possibly be quite unfortunate. You may not get what you want. You might find, worse still, that things really backfire. So perhaps Aries, you're going to need this weekend, a certain amount of discipline, especially on Saturday. Sunday. In fact, Sunday. I think when the moon moves into Cancer is when you're going to need some discipline. When you're going to need to realize that the time for saying things, the time for doing things short term is over, and things are confusing as well. So you might see things that appear to make sense, that seem to give you permission to take action, but you might be looking at a mirage, or it just might be a false signal. So really, Aries, this weekend, I'd love to say that it was a great weekend, but I don't think it is, unless you just, you realize what kind of times you're living in, particularly what kind of times you're living in this weekend, and especially on Sunday. There's nothing that you should be doing, and if you feel a desperate need to take action, then this might be just something just trying to trip you up. And so this goes back to restraint. I think restraint is going to be extremely important this weekend, but you don't want to restrain yourself to the point where it's painful, to the point where you're actually repressing something. I'm not suggesting that. And it just could be that there are ways of expressing yourself in your own way, in your own space, where other people are not necessarily involved, and that might be the best approach. And you can't be taking action all the time, and overall things are or should be relatively quiet, and there just isn't the spark and the fuel that you need to do everything that you want to do. Taurus, a lot of emphasis on Venus, and of course Venus is your ruler, and Venus is opposition Saturn, and it's an aspect which probably isn't great. I mean, you can say some nice things about Venus opposition Saturn if you want. You can say that it helps to structure you. It creates discipline. It encourages you to be sensible. So we can say all of that about Venus opposition Saturn. We might also say that Venus opposition Saturn is quite limiting. You're perhaps aware of what you can't do, and you might also be aware of everything that is stopping you doing whatever it is that you want to do. And at the moment Venus is in Virgo, and not a great sign for Venus to be in, but it's probably been okay over the last few weeks. Usually it hasn't been such a problem, but now you've got Venus opposition Saturn. You could say, well, Venus is weak, and that might be undermining. And so the question is, where are the problems coming from? Now, one source of aggravation could well be other people. We live in a social world, and we are influenced by outside pressure, and most of us, even if we deny it, we do try to conform to some extent. We don't want to go sort of out on a limb, not really. And so when we think about what we do, what we enjoy doing, how we live our lives, it's sometimes difficult to not consider outside pressure. And so that Venus opposition Saturn may be us potentially, or sorry, when I say us, well, yeah, I can say us because I do have Taurus rising. We are aware of what other people think. We're aware of what society disapproves of, and maybe in our attempts to fit in, we mess ourselves up. And so perhaps with this Venus opposition Saturn, the real challenge is to hold on to what we believe in, hold on to what we regard as being important, regardless of any outside pressure. I mean, sure, we've got to consider outside pressure. We can't just assume other people don't exist, and all of us have to conform to some extent, but we don't want to conform in such a way that we totally undermine our own personality and our own freedom of expression. Now, the moon is making a square to Saturn. It's making a square to Venus, so it's part of a T-square. And the moon, in some ways, might hint at a resolution. How do we resolve this issue? There are things bothering you. There are things you're not happy about, I think. And, the moon is in Gemini. On Saturday it's in Gemini, and the moon in Gemini, you could say it's something to do with money. There may be an underlying financial issue which perhaps you're not fully considering. You're perhaps not realizing that money is important, and you try to think it's something else, but maybe it's as simple as that. And so perhaps you've got a situation that you are overcomplicating, and that if you can sort out the material and financial side of things, then that could actually unlock the Venus-Saturn opposition. Now that sounds a very boring, non-spiritual explanation, but sometimes it's as simple as that. It is all about money. Another way of looking at it is to say, well, the moon is in Gemini. Moon in Gemini, it's quite a talkative place for the moon, and maybe Taurus, there's something that needs to be talked about. Probably on Saturday, that if you just were to have the courage to bring it up, to mention it, it would make a real difference. It would allow you and other people to understand each other, and it could break through this deadlock that this Venus-Saturn opposition arguably represents. Now, the moon does change sign. The moon is in Gemini on Saturday, and then on Sunday it moves into Cancer. Quite when it moves into Cancer, it depends on your time zone. If you're in Australasia, it will move into Cancer pretty late in the day. If you're in Europe or America, Africa, it'll be there certainly by the late morning, much earlier in the Americas. And so with the moon moving into Cancer, I do think that things become easier. I think the pressure of that Venus opposition Saturn, starts to dissipate, and your moon in Cancer in its own sign, making a mutual reception to Jupiter, kind of a mutual reception. I mean, moon is in, well, the moon is actually starting to move towards a conjunction of Jupiter very, very slowly, but moon is in Jupiter's exaltation, Jupiter's in the moon's sign. So moon in Cancer just makes things a lot easier, and it also might say something about how you communicate. I think that on Saturday there is just a lack of emotional flow, and any form of communication has to take place on a purely logical level. By Sunday, things do get easier. There is more emotion. I mean, there has to be more emotion because the moon is moving. Moon is moving into Cancer. Okay, it makes a square to Neptune, so don't allow things to get too emotional. But in the end, the moon is making a trine to Mercury, and so slowly, there is perhaps a return to normality, and it's just easier. And you shouldn't forget, Taurus. Venus is now in very late Virgo, and it is getting ready to move into Libra. And Venus moving into Libra, it's a mixed blessing. But one thing we can say about Venus moving into Libra is Venus is moving into the sign of its rulership, and inevitably that's got to help things, provided you handle those energies in the right way. But when I do your horoscope for Monday, I'll be looking at what Venus moving into Libra really means. Gemini, moon is still moving through your sign. Moon is moving through late Gemini on Saturday, and that needn't be so bad. I mean, the moon in Gemini is making a trine to the sun in Libra. So moon trine sun on Saturday, particularly early on Saturday, it's a fortunate aspect. It allows things to flow. I mean, flow pretty well, pretty easily. And if there's anything you want to do it on Saturday, get it done while you've got the opportunity. Because if you leave it too long, things might start to get complicated. And what happens is that as the moon moves through Gemini, the moon moves into late Gemini, it makes a square to Saturn and it makes a square to Venus. So it got this Venus-Saturn opposition today. And this Venus-Saturn opposition is something I'm talking a lot about in this video. And the question is, how does it occur to you? Is it necessarily a bad thing? Well, it depends. It depends what kind of weekend you want to have. So if you were planning on having a fun weekend, doing nothing in particular, no plans to push yourself, then I think that the Venus-Saturn opposition could be a problem. It's an opposition which is across an important angle of your chart. You've got Saturn in Pisces, opposition Venus in Virgo. The Virgo Pisces axis matters to Geminis because it's square Gemini, your sign, and it can have a big relationship to home, career, the work-home balance, for example, to your family, to your sense of direction, to your past. So it's an important axis. And so if you take things in a very sort of light-hearted way, then you could get stomped on, and that's not what the universe wants. And Geminis can do that. Geminis can make light of things, and I'm saying that as someone who's got the sun in Gemini. It's just easier to make light of things, and we're thinking, what's the point? Does it really matter? It's all a bit of a joke, and then it's no longer a joke, and that is perhaps the problem. And if you have a light-hearted weekend, or if you plan on having a light-hearted weekend, the weekend could come down on you like a ton of bricks, or it's that sort of Venus opposition Saturn. But there's another way of looking at it. If, Gemini, you take a serious approach, you come into the weekend with perhaps a high degree of pessimism, you regard life as being difficult, you regard everything as being hard work, everything has to be fought for, you have to be properly prepared. If you take that kind of approach, then I suspect that things will work quite well for you. You will be surprised to the upside, and part of it is to do with the fact that the moon in Gemini, square Saturn, square Venus, you're really able to get yourself together this weekend, if you want to get yourself together. So if you feel disorganized, that you feel that everything is a mess, and that you haven't got enough time, that you haven't got enough hours in the day, that there's pressure left, right and center, that you've got to do your best, then I think that the universe could very well smile on you. At least that's what I'm hoping with my sun in Gemini. So I think it could be a blessing, this Venus-Saturn opposition. But again, you've got to handle it in the right way. If you treat the universe in a light-hearted way, it will treat you very, very seriously. Cancer. A weekend perhaps of two parts. The moon starts the weekend in Gemini, it ends the weekend in Cancer. And that first part of a weekend, Cancer, is probably going to be more difficult than the last half. So, on Saturday, on Saturday, to be fair, the moon is trine Jupiter, moon is trine the sun. And so moon trine the sun, it's not bad. That's not a bad aspect, provided it's handled in the right way. It's not an aspect that is wildly sociable, but it's not wildly sociable simply because the moon is in Gemini and the sun is in Libra. I mean, if it was in different signs, it would work in a different way. But because of the signs, because it's in the air signs, it's an aspect that is perhaps asking you to be calm and just enjoy what you have. Don't feel that you have to do anything. Enjoy the tranquility particularly at the beginning of a weekend, right at the beginning of a weekend. As Friday moves to Saturday, that's what you should enjoy. But, as Saturday progresses, as the moon moves away from that trine to the sun, it makes a square to Saturn, it makes a square to Venus, and that could be really quite troublesome. And you might find, as Saturday unfolds, that there are annoyances, and those annoyances could relate to other people. People are not necessarily being sympathetic, or they may not feel to be, or it may not feel that they're sympathetic, and at the same time, your ability to communicate in your usual way may not be up to scratch. Perhaps because some people are not very sort of emotionally mature. They don't understand the underlying picture. Perhaps they're talking too much as well with the moon in Gemini. And so, this is kind of not what you want. And so, in that sort of central part of the weekend, late on Saturday, I think you should probably keep yourself to yourself. And if you are with people, really make sure that they are the right people, and don't be disappointed if you just can't get your message across. Particularly on that emotional message, you think that people are picking up on your signals. You think they're understanding you, and they don't. And it just seems that they're just being dense. I mean, emotionally dense. Does that mean they don't have much emotional intelligence? I don't know about emotional intelligence. I know about intelligence, but emotional intelligence, people go on and on about it. They've been going on and on about it for years, but I haven't really explored the matter. But perhaps it is a case of people not having emotional intelligence. But there is a change, and the change takes place when the moon moves into Cancer. So, the moon moves into Cancer 7:37 a.m. London time. So that means that if you're in Europe, Africa, the Americas, then by the late morning, the moon will be in Cancer. Okay, if you're in Australia or New Zealand or in parts of Asia, it may not be until sort of later in the day that the moon moves into Cancer. But when the moon does move into Cancer, I think that things just feel a lot easier. Suddenly there is real flow, and the moon is making a square to Neptune when it moves into Cancer. And I think that square Neptune may not be so bad. I think the moon square Neptune, as an aspect, it does have a difficult reputation. One thinks about confusion and reaching the wrong conclusions and not knowing what's going on. But you're a Cancer, you kind of understand these things, and so with that moon square Neptune, you will have a subtlety to you, and you will have a sensitivity, and perhaps when we look back on Saturday, I was talking about people not having emotional intelligence. I was suggesting maybe it's other people, but consider the possibility that you yourself were not picking up on all the signals. And normally you are very sensitive, but maybe there were moments of insensitivity at the beginning of a weekend. But when the moon moves into Cancer, you certainly rediscover your sensitivity, and in a sort of vague kind of way, you understand what's going on, and also you understand what's happening. And this moon square Neptune. Remember that Neptune is at 0 degrees 15 Aries. It's getting ready to go back into Pisces, but it's still it's still in a cardinal sign, Aries. It's very close to the Aries point, and it just may be that through your subtlety and the power of your feelings, you get to understand something. Perhaps it's something about your direction, about where you want to go. You may not be able to verbalize it, but you can certainly feel it. And then, later on Saturday, the moon having made the square to Neptune, it starts to make a trine to Mercury. So, moon in Cancer, making a trine to Mercury. things really start to become clear again. So as you move into Sunday evening, things become clear. All the difficulties and blockages that were perhaps taking place earlier in the weekend, all the confusion and your concerns about other people and other people being emotionally dense, it all starts to clear, and it's just so much easier. And I think that you can be understood by the people who matter, and also you understand them. So I think by the end of the weekend, things aren't looking too bad. Leo, it would be nice if everyone could be trusted. If everyone could get on with each other. I mean, that's what it's all about, isn't it? But it may be hard work, and one reason it might be hard work is because we have got the Sun opposition, Venus. We've got Venus opposition Saturn, and I've been going on and on about this opposition between Venus Saturn, and I think for good reason. I think it is a difficult aspect, and this Venus opposition Saturn is a reminder that Venus is in Virgo. Venus was in Leo, a month ago. This is kind of a last feeling about what it means for Venus to be in Virgo rather than for it to be in Leo. And so you've perhaps discovered, as Venus has moved through Virgo, that things are more complicated than you'd hoped for, and that in order to get what you want, in order to be happy, terrible as it might sound, you have to kind of think about money. I mean, money might have been weighing in on you with Venus moving through Virgo. Perhaps it had been too much of a concern. We've got the South Node in Virgo, and Venus quite recently was conjunct the South Node. So money and matter, material details, all of this had perhaps taken up more of your attention than, strictly speaking, you would have liked. And now we have got Venus opposition Saturn, and you would have liked to have an easy weekend, but this Venus Saturn opposition does make you worry, and it could make you worry about all the things that you haven't got, and that that really doesn't help. And matters might not be helped by other people's attitude. Venus opposition Saturn, maybe another person is creating difficulties for you, and money might be at the root of it all. So this Venus opposition Saturn could potentially undermine your happiness. And also the moon is in Gemini, and moon in Gemini, great, but the moon in Gemini does run into trouble, because what happens is that the moon, as it moves into late Gemini, it does make a trine to the sun. So right at the beginning of a weekend, it might seem that things are fine, even if you are concerned about certain material issues. You can find a way around it. But then, as Saturday progresses, it just may become more and more difficult. And then the moon makes a square to Saturn and a square to Venus, and that moon square Saturn, moon square Venus could manifest as disappointment, just being perhaps sad that certain people are not coming up with the goods, certain people are not delivering, certain people are perhaps not giving you the support you feel that you need. And so if you are, for example, socializing on Saturday evening, if you're invited to a party, for example, you might be disappointed because people are not going to be themselves. They're not going to be particularly open and forthcoming. And so that's perhaps something you need to accept. And if you are going to a party, and if you've been invited to a party or some social gathering on Saturday evening, maybe you should have second thoughts. Maybe it's a situation where invitations should be declined, or it just may be a case of not having expectations. Now, the moon does move into Cancer, and the moon moving into Cancer could take place, early on Sunday. For most of us, for most of us, the majority of Sunday will have the moon moving through Cancer, and so when the moon is moving through Cancer, perhaps you have a chance to reflect and not feel that you have to be involved with anything. And if you are alone on Sunday, if you're alone on Sunday, if there's no pressure, if you're not forcing yourself to do anything on a social level, you're not spending a long time on the phone, if you're just alone on Sunday or with people you trust, then it should be fine. And moon in Cancer is perhaps just a time to sort of recharge your batteries. And I don't think that you should allow yourself to feel pressurized. So I'd love to say that it was going to be a great weekend, but I don't think, all things being equal, that it's going to really be a weekend to write home about. I'm not saying it's going to be a disaster, but it just could be somewhat disappointing. Virgo, Venus opposition Saturn. I've been talking quite a lot about Venus opposition Saturn, and now it's here. So this weekend, Venus is 180 degrees from Saturn. Venus is moving through your sign. And so this aspect, I'm afraid I'm not being positive about it. It's very difficult to be positive about it, although it depends what you want to do with it. Now, if you want to be positive with Venus opposition Saturn, you should be thinking in terms of structure and discipline and, generally sorting things out. And this includes the social environment. So, you've got Venus, the planet of relationships, is still in your sign. And you want to be nice, you want to enjoy other people's company, that's great, but it's opposition Saturn. And so Venus opposition Saturn could represent some kind of disappointment. You are expecting something from another person and they don't deliver. That's one way of looking at it. Or it might be that you are closed down. You don't get the support you were expecting. You really thought you were going to get some support, and you now realize perhaps what someone is really like. And, that's difficult, but it can, in its own way, be quite liberating. So this Venus opposition Saturn, is certainly not a happy aspect. No way can we regard it as being a happy aspect, but it could be useful. Remembering that we do have a T-square. So on Saturday, the moon in Gemini is moving towards a square with Venus, square of Saturn. And I think that this moon in Gemini making that T is possibly really quite useful, and it might actually provide a resolution. And you have to be quite mature about this, because Venus opposition Saturn does represent restriction, and it might also represent how other people are treating you, also perhaps how you are treating them, and it just might seem just a difficult situation. But in the process, you could be learning something. Something may be becoming clear. And as the moon makes a square to Saturn, makes a square to Venus, it becomes increasingly clear. And, there may be a moment where you have an epiphany, an understanding. And this understanding, it may not be a fully happy understanding, but it could be an understanding that just makes sense. You finally get what everything means. And because of this, you're able to make some changes. And these changes perhaps take place at a mental level to begin with. A reminder that you have got to do something. You might want to write it down, and you might then look around you and look at how you've been treated and say, well, this was all for the best, because you were being shown the road ahead, and now there's no possibility of mistakes. Because you can see people for what they are, and that can be very, very valuable. Now, the moon does move out of Gemini and into Cancer, and moon moving into Cancer, I think, makes things easier. It doesn't just make things easier for you, it also makes things easier for other people. So in a social sense, probably Sunday is going to be a better day than Saturday. And the moon moving through Cancer, it in the end, it makes a trine to Mercury. So moon trine Mercury might mean that finally you find a way of getting on with people, being able to really talk to them, in a profound way. Remember, Mercury is in Scorpio. Mercury, your ruler, is in Scorpio. So the moon in Cancer trining Mercury in Scorpio, you could say that this is about having a profound conversation, perhaps with a friend, someone else. You're able to talk about something, and it's just real. And perhaps that's what you should be aiming for. But it might just be a conversation with yourself. Conversations with oneself are always important, or they can be important, because there's a lot to work out, there's a lot to think about. You're still trying to take on board that Venus opposition Saturn. But I think the Venus opposition Saturn is really showing you something. It may not be entirely pleasant, but it's allowing you to move on, perhaps to recognize that some things are no longer worth bothering with, and so you don't have to worry about that anymore. You can perhaps sort of move to the next thing, move to the next opportunity. Libra. I have been spending a lot of time in this video talking about the opposition aspect between Venus and Saturn, and that is the main event of the weekend. And Venus is, of course, your ruler. And so, Venus has been in Virgo for some time. And, Venus is not very happy in Virgo. It's not the greatest sign for Virgo to be in. I mean, it's fallen in Virgo. It's also in the same sign as the South Node. And now it's making an opposition to Saturn. So that might mean that the weekend doesn't necessarily start on a particularly happy note, although it's true that the moon is making a trine to the sun. I think what that moon trine sun means that if you want to salvage something from Saturday in particular, then you've really got to keep your distance. You've got to have some perspective. You've got to gain some height. By gaining height, I mean getting high enough to be able to see everything, like being on a mountaintop. I'm not saying you should go onto a mountaintop, but that moon trine sun can give you the opportunity to look above and beyond things, and not to get caught up in the sort of everyday difficulties that the Venus opposition Saturn might represent. So when you're dealing with that Venus opposition Saturn, perspective does matter. But if you think about what that Venus opposition Saturn might mean, it might just mean that something is just holding you up, and is perhaps getting in the way of your happiness. So what might that be about? Well, the last few weeks, you perhaps have been at times quite introspective, and you've had your worries and you've had your fears. We all have fears and worries. You're not unique in that department. But your fears, your worries, you're picking up on other people's fears and worries, and there was your unconscious has perhaps been quite strong at the moment. And opposition Saturn, you've also been aware of just what needs to be done. And that's what's happening now. You realize that things are perhaps not in good shape, and you are acutely aware of the various imperfections around you. You might be blaming yourself for them, perhaps. This is the culmination of your own neglect. You haven't been paying attention. You've been paying attention to the wrong things. And so that Venus opposition Saturn is perhaps telling you what you need to do. And it's asking you to be constructive about it. And you don't really want to be constructive. And it just feels as if it's all too much. But the moon in Gemini is making a square to Saturn. It's making a square to Venus, and that moon in Gemini may indicate, a resolution. And it's what I was saying. You need that height. You can know that you have to do something, but at the same time, you can put it in context. It's not the be all and end all of everything, and so perhaps that Venus opposition Saturn will finally give you just an awareness of what you need to do to make yourself happy, to make yourself feel whole. And it may not be anything you want to do, but if you can get it done, that would be a really good thing. Now, this Venus opposition Saturn probably is going to be strongest during the first part of the weekend, while the moon is in late Gemini. Now, the moon then moves into Cancer. So on Sunday, the moon is moving into Cancer. In fact, if you're in California, the moon moves into, or Hawaii or Alaska, the moon will move into Cancer late on Saturday. And so with the moon in Cancer, things change, and I think they do change for the better. And it may be that you just start to understand, what needs to be done, and you start to be optimistic about it. And the moon in Cancer, when it moves into Cancer, it's starting to make a conjunction to Jupiter. Now, that conjunction to Jupiter is a long way off. There's 23 degrees between 0 degrees Cancer and where Jupiter is, 24 degrees. So that Moon-Jupiter conjunction is not going to take place this weekend, but it will take place at the beginning of next week. And so this Moon-Jupiter conjunction, is optimistic. It's good for you. You have a Moon-Jupiter conjunction in Cancer, at the moment, sort of every month. So if you miss this Moon-Jupiter conjunction, you've got the next month's Moon-Jupiter conjunction to look forward to. But in general, Moon moving into Cancer on Sunday allows you to be more focused, more positive, and you realize that, however difficult things are, however much there is to do, you are really able to handle it. And furthermore, Libra, you have got Venus moving into your sign very soon. It's like Venus, your ruler, is, it's as bad as it gets in Virgo. It's fallen, opposition Saturn, close to the South Node, and then moves into Libra. Everything changes. Now, as far as when it moves into Libra, just to remind you, Venus moves into Libra on Monday, could be Tuesday, depending on your time zone. So beginning of next week, you've got that to look forward to. And I think you might experience a very rapid change, because Venus moves from arguably the worst possible position to the best possible position, and it happens in an instant. So next week, early next week, there should be real improvements. But I think even by the end of the weekend, you're starting to feel those improvements already. So don't worry, things are not going to get any worse. Scorpio, the sesquiquadrate between Mars and Saturn that I've been talking about for the last few days is starting to weaken. I don't think it's really such an issue anymore. So in one sense, you might feel that some pressure is lifting. You have more scope for taking action and for being yourself. Though, don't forget the heliocentric chart. So I did look at the heliocentric chart, earlier on. So here it is again, just to remind you. So this is the positions of the planets from the viewpoint of the Sun, and you can see that Mars is pretty close to the opposition of Uranus, and Mars is also about to get a square to Venus. And so this heliocentric Mars opposition Uranus, might well say something about you and how you are feeling. And you might feel, Scorpio, that something does have to be done. Something doesn't seem right, and you might be irritated. You might feel that now is the time to take some form of action, and you have to be perhaps somewhat careful there, because you can't just take action for the sake of it. If you do, who knows what's going to happen. On the other hand, if you don't take action, then action might happen anyway. So perhaps, Scorpio, this weekend, you should be trying as far as is possible to keep control of the flow of events. You don't want to be in a situation where other people are making all the decisions. Perhaps you refuse to make decisions. You refuse to make your opinions known. That can be a Scorpio thing. But if you were to do that, then the problem is that you might find that someone else is pulling the strings. So you've got to stay in control, and you've got to sort of keep a lid on things, through your own efforts. And it's not really a time to be, allowing other people to make the decisions, because that might not be especially fortunate. And as far as other people are concerned, we do have a opposition aspect between Venus and Saturn, and this Venus-Saturn opposition may say a lot about the particular people in your life, what they're feeling, what they're experiencing, how they're behaving. One way of looking at Venus opposition Saturn is to say, well, it is a person who cannot express themselves, or cannot express themselves in a natural and spontaneous way. So that may say something about the people around you, the people who are important to you. Maybe they're not as forthcoming as usual. Maybe there's something bothering them, and you perhaps need to certainly accept it, but perhaps also find out what is going on with this Venus opposition Saturn. And it may be that you feel that there are certain people who have, over the last few days, maybe even over the last few weeks, have been retreating, or have been sort of increasingly under the weather. And, now it's becoming clear. And so perhaps, Scorpio, this is an opportunity to, tune into the healing side of your nature. It's perhaps the case that every Scorpio can be healing if they want to be, and there are a lot of blocks that need to be removed with this Venus opposition Saturn. Yeah, blocks which other people might be experiencing, but don't take things too seriously with Venus opposition Saturn. And maybe it's just a case of letting people be. Venus is about to move into Libra, sort of Monday, Tuesday, and so when Venus moves into Libra, you will find that the important people in your life are maybe a little stronger than usual. They're moving away. Venus is moving away from that opposition of Saturn. It's no longer in Virgo, so that certainly should help. Now, as far as you are concerned, you want to do things, you want to take action, but you're still afraid. You're still concerned about what might happen, and you're also aware of everything that could be holding you back. It's not that you are being held back by necessarily anything real or anything concrete, but your perceptions are telling you that it is not a time to take action. And it might be your sensitivity, thinking about the kind of world you're living in, and the kind of vibes that other people are emanating. So yeah, you might hold back this weekend, especially on Saturday. Now the moon does move into Cancer, and this takes place, London time on Sunday morning. And so when the moon moves into Cancer, I do think that things will start to get better. I mean, the moon moving into Cancer, moon is moving into a water sign. There's going to be more flow. And when the moon moves into Cancer, it starts to make a trine to Mercury in Scorpio. Because so you've had Mercury in Scorpio, Mercury's been in your sign for some time. And so with Mercury in Scorpio, moon making that trine, I think it's just going to be easier to get things moving, and it's going to be easier to communicate, and it won't always be easy over the weekend to really tell people how you feel, and other people are perhaps going to be quite reticent. But by the end of a weekend, I do think, Scorpio, that things are going to be a lot easier, and there will be more movement, especially on an emotional level. So don't give up on people this weekend. Because Saturday things might seem a bit grim, but if you keep going, you make sure you're ever present, then this might pay off by the end of the weekend. Sagittarius. There is a T-square at the moment. Venus is opposition Saturn, and the moon is on the T. That means that the moon is making a square to Venus. It's also making a square to Saturn. And, this T-square could well influence you. If you think about it, the moon is in Gemini on Saturday, your opposite sign. And so with the moon in Gemini, you may have to deal with outside forces, things that you don't necessarily have full control over. Okay, even if you don't have to deal with them directly, you're certainly aware of their influence. And then you've also got Venus opposition Saturn, so moon making the square to Venus, making a square to Saturn, and this Venus opposition Saturn, it does matter to you, Sagittarius, because Venus is in Virgo, which is at the top of your chart, and that Venus in Virgo has its uses. It means that you are capable of being practical and down to earth, and also, if need be, you can be quite transactional. You can ask yourself, which people are useful, which people are really not worth bothering with. Yeah, that can be Venus in Virgo. And this transactional approach, may be particularly important when thinking about your career and your ambitions. Yet, Venus is, opposition Saturn. And, with Venus opposition Saturn, it's quite a harsh aspect. And it may be that you feel that you're not getting enough sympathy and appreciation, particularly when it comes to the things that you want to do. And so the question is, how do you deal with it? And with the moon on the T, the moon making a square of Venus, square Saturn, that moon just can't represent forces that do seem to be outside of your control. And you're on your own, and sort of how do you work it all out? And because you are ambitious, but what do you do if you're not getting enough support? And also, I should say that Venus opposition Saturn, is on an axis which can be quite psychological. The 10th house, 4th house relates to the parents, the past, and how the past moves towards the future. It can represent the sort of ego development. And so Venus opposition Saturn, it just may be a time where you're just aware of all the things that have been holding you back in the past, right from the beginning. And we may be talking about distant memories, and it's all very close at the moment. And so it would be very easy to think that you are not getting support, and not just you're not getting support in the present, but that you have not got support in the past. So that's kind of rather gloomy and perhaps not what you wanted to hear. On the other hand, in astrology, the planet on the T can represent a solution. And so that moon in Gemini is maybe indicating that you shouldn't give up on other people. And perhaps people who you thought were going to be a problem could actually be the opposite. So maybe another person can resolve a long-standing issue. So, if you feel blocked, if you feel that absolutely nothing is going on, then, don't despair, because there is a solution. And the very thing that you think is the problem, could indeed be the solution. So the weekend perhaps starts on quite a psychological level, and you do have to think about not just your psychology, but the psychology of other people and how they, interact with each other. Now, the moon moving through late Gemini, in the end, it moves into Cancer. So at some stage on Sunday, even very late on Saturday, if you're in Hawaii, for example, the moon changes sign, and that sign change is different. I mean, it does create a difference, and it means that you need to start to think about something else. You don't have to sort of obsess about other people so much. And when the moon moves into Cancer, it starts to make it makes a mutual reception to Jupiter, because the moon and the Jupiter are in each other's. They're in mixed reception, because the moon is in its own sign in Cancer. It's also in the exaltation sign of Jupiter, and Jupiter, of course, is in Cancer, which is the sun's, which is in its own exaltation, and of course it is in the moon's sign. So the moon in Cancer, in one sense, makes you more intense, but it also makes you luckier, and it allows you not to get so caught up in the kind of issues that what I've just been talking about, and perhaps the difficult influence of that Venus opposition Saturn will start to wane, and additionally you can start to become sort of more self-contained, and that's probably enough. So I think that as Sunday progresses, I think that things do get easier, and you do become more self-contained, and certain people will fade into the background. They won't be so important, and you can start to make your own decisions, and you make your own choices, and also come to your own realizations. Capricorn, you have to pay some attention to other people and really consider the influence you might be having. And the reason I'm saying that is because Venus is opposition Saturn. Now, I've been talking about Venus opposition Saturn, in a relatively negative way, because you think about, poor Venus opposition Saturn, Saturn, this outside force, preventing Venus from functioning properly. But of course, Saturn is your ruling planet. And so maybe that Saturn represents you, and that Venus represents another person. And so that might be another person feeling pressurized by you. Perhaps you're able to make someone feel very self-conscious, and you can perhaps undermine another person's confidence. You can do that. I'm not saying that you will do that, but in all your interactions, really think about how you are occurring. And this is especially the case if the interaction involves someone who perhaps has less power than you, less influence than you, where you are somehow at a higher level for now, in whatever way. I mean, it just could be a hierarchy, whatever it is. And so perhaps you need to show some consideration and perhaps even tone yourself down, and don't be critical, just for the sake of it. But there are other ways of looking at Venus opposition Saturn. It could be that Venus is challenging you. Can Saturn be hurt by Venus? Is it always Saturn hurting Venus? Well, perhaps Venus in Virgo represents someone doing something that you hadn't really planned for. It's kind of an irritation, and you don't fully appreciate it, and it forces you to ask questions about yourself that you perhaps hadn't wanted to ask. And it could also be a clash of ideas. You're thinking about your ideas and other people's ideas, and there may be a disagreement about ideology or morality. So that's certainly a way in which the Venus Saturn opposition might work. Now, as far as sort of resolving this, I mean, the moon is in Gemini, so conversation can go a long way, especially on Saturday, towards resolving any misunderstandings. Conversation is something that you can often be very impatient about talking. You don't like it when people do too much talking. It can be annoying, and why not just do something rather than just talk about it? But there is a place for conversation, for civilized conversation, and conversation which is also serious, which can really deal with the underlying issues. Now, the moon does change sign, moves into Cancer, and that takes place it could take place very late on Saturday if you're on the west coast of America. It could be late on Sunday if you're in Australasia. But by the end of the weekend, the moon does move into Cancer, and probably that makes things easier, especially when it comes to other people. Moon in Cancer, it's a nice place. So the moon is in the same sign as Jupiter, and it's making a trine to Mercury. So moon moving into Cancer, contacts are easier, conversation is easier, it's easier to understand people and for them to understand you. So overall, possibly Saturday could be a difficult day. There's a lot to annoy you, and there's a lot of ways in which you can annoy other people. But by the end of the weekend, I think that things will be much improved. Aquarius. We have an opposition between Venus and Saturn. I mean, that's what I've been telling everyone. And this Venus-Saturn opposition does affect you. And the reason it affects you is because Saturn is your ruler. Saturn is in Pisces, and Venus is in the opposite sign. And so this Venus-Saturn opposition might represent some kind of challenge, because Saturn is your ruler. It's not like you are being challenged by Saturn, because you are Saturn. You're being challenged by Venus, and Venus is a very different energy from Saturn, and it could be that things are pointed out to you. Things are pointed out to you that you don't want to know about, you don't want to hear. And people are capable of making observations, and these observations might really have no logic to them. But what people say, what people point out, you should really notice this, because you don't get everything, and maybe you don't get everything about yourself. And you may be able to understand more about yourself and your weaknesses through not just other people's observations, but just through other people's behavior, the way you're being treated. And so in any social interaction, however trivial, be on your guard and be ready for a sudden bout of tension. And that bout of tension comes about probably because you feel yourself to be pressurized. And the other person probably doesn't even mean to pressurize you. They don't think they're doing anything, but they are. And that might be the nature of this Venus opposition Saturn. And so perhaps you need to be able to take criticism, whether it's direct or just implied. And perhaps the answer to this Venus opposition Saturn, is the Moon. The Moon is making a square to Venus. It's making a square to Saturn. So we've got a T-square, and so it could be that you are being encouraged to do something that you don't necessarily want to do, and it may link to your fundamental creativity. You may think you're being as creative as you can be, but through your interactions with other people, it may occur to you that you could be doing a better job, that you could be making more of what you have. And so if there are times over the weekend, particularly on Saturday, where you're feeling somewhat inadequate and sort of underused, well, it might be good that you feel like that, because maybe you need to escalate things and perhaps in your own way be a little more extreme. By extreme, I mean just single-minded, deciding that something is important, something is important about you, and that you really do, need to, give it your best shot. So, every social interaction, every time you talk to someone, there is the possibility of something happening, of you realizing something, and it's important that you don't overreact to criticism. I mean, you could overreact to criticism, and if someone criticizes you and you overreact, they'll just go away. And will you have benefited? I don't think you would have benefited at all. You may, in fact, have been removing a source of growth. So be prepared for challenges over the weekend, and don't think that you have just got all the answers. Pisces, there is action in your sign. Saturn is in Pisces now. It's retrograde in Pisces, and so with Saturn in Pisces, you're feeling quite defensive at times. You want to protect yourself. You want to make sure that you're able to look after yourself, and you don't want your boundaries to be overstepped. But Venus is making an opposition to Saturn, and it's across the main axis of your chart. And with this Venus opposition Saturn, this might say something about relationships and about how you get on with people. And Venus in Virgo could represent another person, and this other person may not always be to your liking. They may be just too concerned about detail. They may be annoying. And with Venus opposition Saturn, they could be particularly annoying. And there could be some kind of conflict. I mean, that does make sense. So the question is, what do you do about this conflict if there is a disagreement? If you find that other people's approach is just intolerable, I mean, do you just batten down the hatches? Do you just shut someone off? I mean, that is certainly a possibility with Venus opposition Saturn, though the Moon is making a square to Saturn, and it's making a square to Venus. So this could represent some kind of resolution, the Moon in Gemini. And so the Moon in Gemini can be about talking, discussing. It can also be about you thinking about what is important. So you have a disagreement. You see that two things are completely at odds with one another, and so what do you do? Well, you decide, what is important, and that may be all that it takes. And so you really try to get a perspective, and maybe Pisces, particularly on Saturday, there's really nothing much that you have to do. Perhaps you should avoid conflict, avoid people who in the past have caused trouble. Now, Sunday, I think Pisces is probably going to be a better day, and the reason for that is that the moon is changing sign. The moon is moving out of Gemini, it's moving into Cancer, and so there will be more harmony. I think things will move quicker, and on an emotional level you'll feel more connected, and perhaps it'll occur to you that other people are more connected, because when the moon moves into Cancer, it starts making a trine to Mercury, and so with this trine to Mercury, you have a chance to perhaps start again, especially in a social sense. So if you and someone else have got off on the wrong footing and there appears to be a disagreement, then with moon trine Mercury, you can have another go. And this time round, you perhaps will realize that there are certain things that you don't have to talk about. You can change your focus, and by changing the focus, by talking about other things, by perhaps being more broad-minded, by focusing on the higher things, maybe of a spiritual and inspirational level, that is the way to move forward. So overall, Pisces, I think the weekend could be difficult. I think the weekend could certainly start on a difficult note, but as the weekend progresses, as the moon moves into Cancer, things do become easier. And I think that by the end of a weekend, it could be that you kind of feel at one with yourself, and maybe even you might feel at one with another person. And those are my forecasts for the 12 signs. So now it's time to look at things from a viewpoint of the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is the weekend going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 40, which is deliverance. So deliverance indicates a difficult situation that we need to somehow extricate ourselves from. And because it's deliverance, it's saying, yes, we can get out. It's not too late. And the question is, what does all of this mean? So we have the fifth line moving, and this seems to say a lot about other people. It talks about maybe inferior people. Now, it could be that we need to deliver ourselves from other people. Other people might be the problem. Perhaps our life has got cluttered up with people who are just not doing us any good anymore. Or it could relate to particular relationships, maybe, that are not doing us any good. But we have to remove ourselves. Although there is an alternative view that we are setting an example. So there's a sort of an indication of leadership. So it might not just be us who is in a difficult position, but it could be a lot of other people as well. And someone has to make the first move. Someone has to say, look, this is no good. This isn't going anywhere. We need to take action now. And if we can do that, if perhaps we can show some leadership, then other people will perhaps accept, our authority and, follow our lead. But it is all quite exhausting, having to perceive a problem, then resolve it in a way that may not be entirely easy, but if we can show sort of moral strength and character, then I think that we'll do a good job of it. But it can be exhausting, and because the fifth line moves, that moves us to a second hexagram, which is hexagram number 47, which is oppression. And you can see the oppression here. And if you look at the shape of the hexagram, the top three lines, the top trigram is the lake. And the bottom three lines is the abyss. So you've got an abyss below a lake. So that's kind of like a sinkhole. All the water from a lake is flooding out. And so that's why it's just completely exhausting. All our energy, the life force is being sapped by having to deal with this problem, having to escape from something. But it's okay. We are just taking on responsibility. And yeah, taking on responsibility is exhausting. But it's the right thing to do. And although there's a lot of oppression here, we feel oppressed, we feel as if we're carrying a big weight on our shoulders, it's okay. We're going to get through, and we will do the right thing. And maybe we're talking about this escaping from something, feeling exhausting, feeling oppressed. It sort of fits in with what's happening astrologically this weekend. That Venus opposition Saturn is quite an oppressive aspect. And now I want to look at that aspect and consider, what it might mean. So here is the chart for the opposition between Venus and Saturn. So this Venus-Saturn opposition takes place at 12:11 p.m, just before lunch maybe, on Saturday, London time. And here it is. There's Venus at 27 Virgo and Saturn at 27 Pisces. Now, traditionally, Venus-Saturn aspects are considered to be difficult. That makes sense, doesn't it? Venus is the planet of relationships. It's quite an emotional planet. It wants to make connections. And then Saturn comes along, and Saturn completely squelches it. It stops Venus in its tracks. And Venus is already under pressure. Venus is in Virgo, which is it's fallen in Virgo, and then it's opposition Saturn. So Venus opposition Saturn and Venus in Virgo, they actually have quite similar meanings. So Venus in Virgo is perhaps about concentrating just too much on material details, for example, money. And how does one really relate to someone properly if one is thinking about the details, what someone looks like, how much money they have, where is this transaction going? Yeah, being transactional about it. And Venus opposition Saturn is likewise potentially transactional. And both Venus in Virgo and Venus opposition Saturn have been associated, can be associated with prostitution. Now, I can be quite general about that. Prostitution is just about relating for money, being transactional, not thinking about the moment, thinking about the time, what's happening on the clock, how much money is this transaction going to bring. And it's just not thinking about the relationship itself. So there's a double reason for thinking that this aspect is this Venus-Saturn opposition, could be troublesome, and it may just be seen as being just a difficult aspect. And what makes this aspect even more interesting is the fact that it involves the moon as well. So here's the chart. Here's the chart for the precise time that the aspect takes place. But if we looked at the middle of a weekend, set for New York at midnight, when the moon is at 28 degrees Gemini, there we have the full T-square. So there will be a moment over the weekend where this Venus-Saturn opposition really does come into focus. That would be New York time, at around midnight, or you can make appropriate adjustments. So that would be what would that be, 5 in the morning in Europe, for example. Maybe we shouldn't worry too much about it. It is just the moon, and the moon does move very quickly. So, this Venus-Saturn opposition. Now, what can we expect over the weekend with this Venus-Saturn opposition? It just could be that the weekend is disappointing, that there just is not an emotional flow over the weekend. If one has sort of planned anything connected with entertainment, enjoyment, parties, where people just want to be themselves with Venus opposition Saturn, it may not happen. It may not work to plan. And anything to do with art, money, art and money, I know two very different things. I mean, because Venus can rule money, but if you think about art, you go to an art gallery with Venus opposition Saturn, there's a lot of criticism there, and that's another aspect of Venus opposition Saturn, criticizing things, breaking things down to their component parts, and just turning something into something very meaningless. I mean, that is the problem. I mean, with art, you need to have a sense of fantasy. You need to be able to connect everything together. Yeah, it's not real, but you know that if you go behind the stage, you can see what's really going on, but you lose the magic of it. And Venus opposition Saturn can destroy the magic, because you reduce things to their component part, and also you think about who is benefiting. You can't just take something at face value. You have to split it up, and that may say something about the weekend. But Venus opposition Saturn may not be such a bad thing. Sometimes it is necessary to ask these questions to really get beyond the pleasant face of something and really understand what you're dealing with. And Venus opposition Saturn can be very meticulous. It can have a very keen sense of detail. And again, that might not be such a bad thing. Sometimes we have to, understand, what is going on, and not be deluded. Now, Venus, additionally, is a natural significator of women. And so Venus opposition Saturn may indicate that women in the public eye are not being treated properly, are being maybe disrespected, or there may be news about women. Venus opposition Saturn can be the death of a woman. I mean, that is a possibility. So if you look at a few events which took place when Venus was opposition Saturn, I mean, this may just be coincidental, but for example, Janis Joplin, she died on October the 4th, 1970, I think, of a heroin overdose. So Janis Joplin was obviously an iconic 60s star. Another death was that of Joseph Stalin. So Joseph Stalin died on March the 5th, 1953, in the evening of that day, when there was an opposition aspect between Venus and Saturn, a very close Venus-Saturn opposition. Now, you might say, perhaps that was a good thing that Stalin died, but I don't think that is how many people in the Soviet Union at the time saw it. Okay, you could say that they were so afraid they had to show their tears and so forth, but I get the impression that it was very real, the sense of mourning and shock when Stalin died in the Soviet Union, whatever you think of him. And it's kind of interesting that he wasn't the only person that died on March the 5th, 1953 in Moscow. Another person who died in Moscow on March the 5th, 1953 was Sergei Prokofiev, the composer. He died on the same day as Stalin, which is kind of a bad day to die, because according to the story, at Sergei Prokofiev's funeral, they couldn't get any flowers. So Venus opposition Saturn, not being able to get flowers for the funeral, because why couldn't they get any flowers for the funeral? Because every flower in the Soviet Union was being diverted to Stalin's funeral, so there was nothing left for Sergei Prokofiev. So with Sergei Prokofiev, you could say that Venus opposition Saturn, that's more in keeping with the death of a musician or the death of a composer. So you had two deaths with Venus opposition Saturn in Russia on the same day of famous people. Obviously, Sergei Prokofiev is not as famous as Stalin, but he's still regarded as being a very important composer. And Venus opposition Saturn is, may just be a signature of bad events. You take the Bayesian, for example. The Bayesian was that ship which, that yacht that was destroyed in a storm off Palermo last year. It was a state-of-the-art ship, but I think that was it. I don't quite know what went wrong with that boat, but this sort of British multi-millionaire was killed in this. So yeah, Venus opposition Saturn can just represent difficult events, problem events. And of course, in this case, we likewise have Venus in Virgo opposition Saturn in Pisces, and Venus opposition Saturn may also say something about an organization. The Chequer, which is the precursor to the NKVD, the first communist security apparatus, started by Felix Dzerzhinsky. So when the Chequer came into being on December the 20th, 1917, there was Venus in Aquarius opposition Saturn in Leo. So you could say Venus in Aquarius opposition Saturn in Leo represents something very harsh, a very brutal organization. So I think that's a few events. Now, what about people? What's it like if you've got Venus opposition Saturn in your chart? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, has Venus opposition Saturn. Don't have a time of birth for him, but he has Venus in Scorpio opposition Saturn in Taurus. He does strike me as being a rather Venus-Saturn kind of person. He makes speeches, but he's kind of seems sort of, I don't know, I could get the impression he seems kind of silent and sort of resentful, and I don't get a good feeling about Sadiq Khan, and maybe it's the fact that he's got Venus in Scorpio opposition Saturn. He likes to be in control, and he's not going to be really someone who's going to really compromise. But I'm not in London. I used to live in London. I haven't lived in London for a very long time, so I'm perhaps not really the person to comment on Sadiq Khan. Maybe if you do live in London, you can perhaps think about Venus opposition Saturn and whether that really does say anything about him. Venus opposition Saturn can give you structure, can give you sufficient structure to do great things. Julius Caesar had Venus opposition Saturn, and Venus opposition Saturn, Venus in Cancer opposition Saturn, certainly very organized, an effective military leader, and of course very brutal. And he does what he says. According to the story, when he was kidnapped by pirates, so he's captured by pirates, they ransomed him off, and he told the pirates that, when I'm released, I will come back and I will crucify you. And apparently that's what he did. So that's one aspect of Venus opposition Saturn. And I suppose if you're a military commander, it might help to have Venus opposition Saturn, because you have to be quite brutal. You do whatever it takes. Though maybe Venus opposition Saturn might suggest that he falls out with people, or he pushes things too far. In the end, things might go wrong for him. And of course, Venus opposition Saturn, maybe with Venus opposition Saturn, there could be something slightly unfortunate about it, which might have hinted at his assassination. Now, Venus opposition Saturn, from a positive point of view, we talked about Julius Caesar and being able to organize things, and it just might be about someone who's really into structure. Things have to be absolutely right. And that could mean, we talked about the death of Prokofiev when Venus was opposition Saturn. I don't think that Prokofiev had Venus opposition Saturn in his chart, but a singer who had Venus opposition Saturn in his chart was Frank Sinatra. So here's Frank Sinatra's chart, and Frank Sinatra had Venus in Capricorn, opposition Saturn in Cancer. So that might represent the hard work required to be an effective singer. But it also says something about him. I mean, things like loyalty, punctuality, reliability, and clothing were especially important to Frank Sinatra. Apparently, Frank Sinatra didn't like people wearing jeans, and he said, as far as clothing is concerned, clothes make the man. Naked people have little or no influence on society. At least that's what ChatGPT told me that Frank Sinatra said. And that might indicate Venus opposition Saturn. Venus is about style, it's about beauty, it's about how one looks. So if you've got Venus opposition Saturn, you could take your clothes very, very seriously. And another person who took things seriously in a completely different way was the architect Frank Lloyd Wright. So Frank Lloyd Wright had Venus in Taurus, opposition Saturn in Scorpio. He wanted things to be absolutely right, and with his particular approach to buildings. I don't really know a great deal about Frank Lloyd Wright. I know he's a famous architect, but everything had to be functional. You didn't want to have a building that was created just to be decorative. Everything in that building had to have a reason, I believe. And so that could be Venus opposition in Saturn, Venus conjunct Pluto in Taurus opposition Saturn, really thinking about how the building is structured and structure in general. So perhaps having Venus opposition Saturn is good if you want to be an architect. And going back to the theme of sort of entertainment, Clint Eastwood has Venus opposition Saturn. Now, Venus opposition Saturn may say something about his work ethic. Of course, it may also say something about his image. The man with no name, and Dirty Harry coming over as someone who is being, very tough and quite brutal. Iconic because Make My Day, killing people in the Dirty Harry films, for example. So perhaps that says something about Clint Eastwood's general persona, but it also might say something about his personality, that is maybe quite tough. I don't know. I don't really know anything about Clint Eastwood. And finally, someone who is in the news, and this Venus-Saturn opposition kind of fits, is Brigitte Macron. Her Venus is a bit of a train wreck in some respects. She's got Venus in Aries, in its detriment in Aries, and also her Venus is combust. It's close to a very strong sun, within less than a degree from the sun in Aries, and her Venus is opposition Saturn and Neptune. So maybe it's not surprising that Candace Owens has done all these videos questioning her femininity, suggesting that she's not a woman. Now, it might be that Venus opposition Saturn, she's just attracting that kind of thing. And so that just could be the way Venus opposition Saturn works. But another way of looking at Venus opposition Saturn, given that Venus is so weak, is it really weak? Maybe it's acting in an unusual way. I mean, Venus in Aries perhaps just wants things. Venus opposition Saturn is maybe encouraging immorality, and I think that there is something fundamentally immoral about Brigitte Macron in terms of how she got involved with Emmanuel. I mean, he was a student of hers, and she, had a relationship with him and got married to him. Now, he might have got married to her as an adult, but that relationship started when he was essentially a child. And so that might be how that Venus opposition Saturn is working. We're perhaps seeing an unpleasantness to it, and maybe even a transactional side to it. She's thinking, here's her student, how can she benefit? What is she looking for from him? Is it just that she wants a young man in her life, or is she perhaps looking for something else? Did she perhaps have some big vision? Because I would guess that, if Emmanuel Macron hadn't had a relationship with Brigitte, probably he wouldn't be president, because, it's like butterflies' wings. If one thing hadn't have happened, then another thing wouldn't have happened. But I do think that somehow that Venus opposition Saturn in Brigitte Macron's chart really does feel as if it works, and it's her. It's her Venus. It's not being projected. That's who she is, Venus in Aries, and it is a very difficult Venus. Now, you could say that she's been quite successful with her Venus. She's married someone who became president of France, and maybe she's been successful because that Venus opposition Saturn is quite ruthless, and that Saturn's in Libra. Saturn's exalted in Libra. She knows what she wants, and maybe that's how that Venus opposition Saturn is working in her case. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again very soon.